Greetings to all, especially those of you who are celebrating All Together, a virtual combination of Rice's Homecoming and Families Weekend. This is one of a multitude of events this week that will highlight some of the many fascinating things that are going on here at Rice. I'm George Zodro, Chair of the Economics Department. I would like to welcome you to a new lecture series, Conversations with Our Faculty, which perhaps not too surprisingly will feature Economics Department faculty discussing their ongoing research projects. This lecture series is conducted under the auspices of RISE, the Rice Initiative for the Study of Economics, a multi-year effort dedicated to improving research and teaching in economics at Rice. Before we get started, I'd like to make three brief announcements. First, I'm delighted to report that last week, Vivian Ho in our department was elected to the National Academy of Medicine, recognizing her many contributions to the advancement of the medical sciences, healthcare, and public health. We congratulate Vivian on this well-deserved honor. Second, many of you know that one of the best things about RISE has been our Nobel Laureate Lecture Series, which has brought some of the world's most prominent economists to the Rice campus. I'm delighted to report that Doyle Arnold, who is one of the 50th reunion giving chairs this year, has made an incredibly generous gift endowing the Nobel Laureate Lecture Series, a gift that will allow us in perpetuity to hear from the brilliant scholars whose path-breaking contributions have shaped the field of economics. We'd like to offer our deepest thanks to Doyle. And third, I know we say we don't pay all that much attention to national rankings, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Niche Magazine, which conducts an annual ranking of undergraduate economics programs, just ranked the Rice Economics Department 8th in the nation. We also maintained our 12th place position in the college factual rankings. We're delighted that our efforts of recent years are garnering such national attention. So let's begin our program. We'll have a little bit of time after each talk for questions and answers. There should be a small Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please submit your questions there during the talks, and I will pose some of them to our speakers. Since our format is basically that of a TED Talk, it was only natural that we would begin with our own Ted Lock-Temzalidis. Ted is the George and Cynthia Mitchell Professor in Sustainable Development in our department, as well as a Baker Institute Center for Energy Studies scholar, and we've been fortunate to have him here at Rice since 2008. His research interests include environmental inequality and global health, conservation and resilience, and non-standard models of decision-making. His talk today, which is based on an article that appeared recently in the prestigious journal Science, is entitled Ecology and Economics for Pandemic Prevention. Ted.
Thank you, George. Let me see. Okay, I'm sharing my screen, so I hope everybody can see this. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks to RISE and thanks to George for the invitation. And I'm particularly honored to share the podium, so to speak, with my colleague, Dr. Malish Pai, who is one of the rising stars in our profession. As you heard, the title of the presentation is Ecology and Economics for Pandemic Prevention. We'll be talking about how zoonotic disease, in other words, disease that started in animals and find its ways to human hosts, emerges, and a few ideas about prevention. We'll talk about how to reduce frequency of emergence. We will not talk today about economic policies during a pandemic. The last is a very interesting topic, but it belongs to a different conversation and deserves a talk on its own. Now, the emergence of something like COVID-19, I will argue, was a matter of time. This was definitely not a black swan, but something that was waiting to happen. So is the next pandemic. So what does economic have to say about this, and how can it help us make this less frequent? As George said, I will base my presentation today on two papers. The first appeared in Science in July and focuses exclusively on COVID-19. And this is mainly what this presentation will be based on. There's another paper that was recently submitted, not yet published, that studies pandemics over the last 70 years and goes beyond beyond COVID-19 looks more broadly at similar issues. The research was done by an interdisciplinary team from literally all around the world. And it was really a pleasure and incredibly interesting to work with a team that involved medical doctors, virus and infection disease. Yes.
So apparently the screen's not being shared.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Let me see. Can you see it better now?
There you go.
All right. I'm sorry about that. So these are the members of our team. And as I was saying, this is a really, truly interdisciplinary team from around the world. It involves specialists in many fields, including medical doctors, biologists, ecologists, and of course, economists. When it comes to ecology and emerging pathogens, again, the COVID-19 pandemic is in no way unique. Wildlife is a hotbed of viruses, and increased human-wildlife interface is what causes these viruses to come to humans with higher probability. This comes from in several ways. It involves agricultural intensification and deforestation and habitat fragmentation. This leads to wildlife coming into contact both with humans and with livestock, passing these viruses to humans. Another channel that we concentrate on analysis on is wildlife trade. And that is another channel through which these viruses can find their way to human communities. Add to that increased connectivity through aviation, and you have an increased pandemic frequency over the years. Indeed, this day and age, no country is an island, not even island countries, and somebody who is infected can pass the virus to a different continent within 24 hours. It can be anywhere in the world. This table, this print is a little small, but I hope you can see it. Talks about mortality from zoonotic viral emergence in humans. It looks at the last 70 years from 1950 on, with the addition of Spanish flu, which was such a dramatic event in the beginning of the 20th century. And you can see many of these diseases passing from animals, many of these viruses passing from animals to humans killed millions of people. This includes HIV, which was in a way unique because these deaths were spread over many decades, which is somewhat unusual, but also many influenza incidents. COVID-19 at the bottom here I don't have the total yet, but as you know, it's immense. And there are things here like SARS and MERS that I will talk about in a second that didn't reach deaths in the thousands. But I would argue the best way to think of those is as near misses. Let me start with SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome in 2002. These slides are taken from a presentation that Dr. Susan Weiss gave a couple of weeks ago to the National Academy of Medicine. Virus starting with a bat, transformed to a kind of a cat, a mammal, civet, then human-to-human interaction, mainly stayed within China and Hong Kong. Mortality was somewhat high at 9.6%. Moving to the next virus, MERS. Again, Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. Again, starting with a bat, camels was the main mammal host, transformed to other camels, of course, but also to humans. Stayed mainly in the Middle East, and there were a few incidents in Korea associated with some Middle Eastern visitors in the area. Thankfully, it stayed, it was concentrated, didn't become a true pandemic because the mortality level was rather high at about 35%. Moving to SARS-CoV-2, which is what we're facing right now, which is, by the way, the virus for COVID-19, coronavirus in the year 2019. Similar transmission, we are not sure, but we suspect, again, that the virus started with bats, was transferred either through wildlife trade or with direct interaction through some mammal species and then to humans. Of course, there was human-to-human interaction, and we are talking now about a true global pandemic. Now, it's easy to blame the bats. Please don't do that. Bats are incredibly well adapted creatures. They are well adapted to their environment. They're incredibly useful, and they're best left alone. This map is from a paper that was published in Scientific Reports a few years back. It shows two maps of Central and Eastern Africa. And the way you should read this, the dark brown areas here are areas where there's very little forestation. This is where mainly humans are located. Green, and as it gets darker green, there's more forestation. And as the yellow triangles correspond to independent incidents of Ebola incidents in humans. This is not true of 100% of the cases, but the majority of cases, as you see, are close to the interface where humans and human livestock are coming close to wildlife. And that's really the first place where the viruses are passing and they come closer to us. In our paper, we perform a cost-benefit analysis, again, concentrated on the COVID virus, coronavirus, COVID-19. We consider several scenarios. Our analysis is super conservative because, unfortunately, things turned out to be much worse than we thought. This makes our case, of course, stronger, but at the same time, it's a very unfortunate outcome. We looked at a scenario where coronavirus is the only virus that we consider. And of course, as I showed you from the table before, things are much worse. And we assume that something of this magnitude occurs every 100 years. So the probability is 0.01. We asked them the question, we can price some prevention measures that will reduce the probability of the pandemic emergence, but we can't tell exactly by how much these measures are going to reduce the probability of emergence. So what we asked ourselves is the question of, by how much does the probability of emergence have to be decreased from this 1% so that we break even, so that these measures make sense? As I said, this calculation is incredibly conservative, partly because we only consider COVID-19, and partly because our calculation stopped in July. That's when the paper was published, and we didn't count the cost to the economy, deaths, the human toll, and or other costs associated with COVID-19 that have come since. We found that in the leading scenario, reducing the probability by 1/3 was enough to break even, given the measures we are proposing. I'll tell you about these measures in a second. And in fact, this is significantly less if we take into account that some of the measures we are proposing have additional climate change benefits. This is a graph that was prepared by the Guardian, a British newspaper, when they were presenting our results, and I think it's a really nice way of summarizing them. So what you see on the left, the square, I don't know what color is this, I'll call it pink. So this pink square corresponds to the cost associated with the COVID-19. And these costs have mainly two components. One is the cost associated with lost GDP, and we use estimates from the World Bank, the IMF, and other estimates of our own on that front. And an additional important part of the cost is cost associated with mortality. We use a methodology, an actuarial methodology called value of statistical life, in order to assign dollars lost to each human life lost. It sounds like something that only an economist would do, but we do need to evaluate this cost somehow. And this corresponds to the 11.5 trillion cost associated with COVID, again, as of sometime in July. What you see in the small square, in the small red square here, is really, in comparison, the sizes are corresponding to the dollar value. So the small square is the yearly cost of the prevention costs from the measures that we are proposing. These are yearly costs, they are not one-time costs. but you can see the size is very different. In fact, if we take this little square and magnify it, you can see where the main components of these mitigation measures that we are proposing lie. The vast majority comes from ending wild meat trade in China. This poses some challenges, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, but this is one of the main costs. Reducing tropical deforestation is the second biggest cost. This is captured by this relative size of this triangle, of this, square, which you should consider again as being the little side, but it wouldn't show if we consider this little one. That's why I magnified. And finally, there are costs associated with early disease detection and control, and also reducing spillovers via livestock. A word about deforestation. Deforestation is mainly used in order for agriculture to take over. So there are some economic losses to preventing deforestation. At the same time, the reduction in the human-to-animal interface is something that reduces the probability of a pandemic emerging. We're never going to drive this probability to zero. It's an issue about reducing it. What does economics have to do with all this? Bob Aumann, a Nobel laureate in economics some years back, was asked to use one word to define economics. And he used incentives. And you're going to hear about this in the next talk that follows as well. So economics is all about incentives. Banning wildlife trade is difficult. There are social norms, many traditions, and in fact, in many of these societies, this is used for medicinal purposes. People believe, without proof in virtually all cases, that there are medicinal advantages associated with consuming wildlife. Driving it all underground is not going to work. Again, we know this from economics, the study of incentives. If there is a demand for this activity, we will just drive it underground, and this will create more harm for biodiversity, as we won't be able to monitor it at all. It's best to regulate, educate, and offer alternatives. In particular, in China, this activity and wildlife trade has been encouraged for many years as a major source of employment. So something else will need to take its place. And just in case this looks like something very far away that we have nothing to do with, please keep in mind that developed countries are mainly responsible for demand for fur and for exotic pets. The United States is a big demand center for that, and all of these are associated with wildlife management. The United States spends about 3.6 trillion annually on health, but devotes a very small fraction of that on public health and prevention. In fact, even that small fraction has been shrinking over the decades. It's not, the shrinking is not a recent event. It's been happening over time. That needs to change. More importantly, coordination, or I should say equally important, coordination across countries is necessary, but it has proved difficult. The World Health Organization has been playing that role largely. It's an imperfect organization, but either a reformed World Health Organization or something else will have to play this coordinating role. Yet, despite our best efforts, a new pandemic will emerge. In fact, the next pathogen is already living with some bats, and it's a matter of time before it reaches us. We need a global plan to identify the novel viruses in wildlife and livestock, test their capacity to infect human cells, raise the red flag when we see the danger, and respond early if all else fails before things reach the level of a true pandemic like the one we're facing now. In conclusion, there's a new realization of how globally interconnected we are. Global problems, and this includes climate change, it certainly includes pandemics, cannot be addressed within an individual nation, no matter how powerful that nation might be. The cost of prevention is well worth the investment, and pool global monitoring and research are the best way to be prepared for the next event. It's just a matter of time. On that note, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to try to answer any questions.
Okay, Ted, we've got a couple of questions for you from the audience. One is, would an insurance-based response to the economic damage of pandemics make sense? If the government had mandated pandemic insurance before COVID-19, then now we could focus on the medical problem and just file damage claims for the economic damage. Since we didn't do that, why not run the clock backwards with the government funding the damage payments via existing insurance companies while paying the premiums out of future tax revenues?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So insurance is a mechanism for diversifying risk that is very effective on many occasions. Something like that is a little harder to implement. For one, we are not talking about a national, but we're talking about an international, a global event. So where insurance is the most effective is when there's what economists call idiosyncratic but not aggregate risk. Think of car insurance. Some of us are going to have accidents, car accidents during the day, any given day. The majority of the population is not. Same thing with health insurance. So the way this works is that due to large number of people, some of them will be affected, some will not. Everybody's affected with some probability, but there is this possibility of directing resources from those who were not affected through the premiums to those who were affected. A pandemic like this tends to affect everybody. So insurance, while ideally would be a desirable measure, it's really hard to make it work, especially at the global level.
Okay. Could you comment a bit more on how you value lives lost in your economic analysis of the costs?
Yeah. So the value of statistical life calculation is an interesting concept. Is used by actuarial scientists, for example, when they calculate premiums and payoffs regarding to life insurance. And it's based on really observed behavior by humans. It's not based on one's income. So it's not that the value of my life would be the income that would be lost if I was to die. That doesn't enter the calculation, but it's more like we each make decisions that increase the probability of death by a little bit, and that is associated with a premium, a wage premium, for example. A typical example of this is if we think of deep sea divers working, for example, for the oil industry, some of them in Houston. So as you are undertaking a role in this deep sea diving, you're taking an increased risk. To that risk is associated with wage premium. So the increased probability of death or severe accident associated with a more dangerous job is combined with a premium associated with performing that task. This gives us information about how much we value the risk of death and therefore overall the life. Another example that is interesting about this with HIV, for example, you see these 30 million deaths that occurred with HIV, they didn't all occur at the same time. They occur over a period of decades. So we need some measure to capture the fact that, in fact, if all 30 million deaths occurred at the same time, that would have been much more costly than having them spread out over several decades. So with HIV, we actually have to discount these values to take into account the fact that they occurred over several decades. So even something like having this death spread out is something that you need to consider for this calculation.
Okay. Are you aware of any studies that examine the impacts of reducing interconnected supply chains as a means of reducing the transmission of disease such as COVID-19?
Not so much about supply chains, because once I'm not aware of these studies. I don't think that effect will be as dramatic. I haven't done the study, so I'm just speculating right now. But I think one idea that has emerged is that as we are, if we were to become independent from other countries, for example, in terms of the supply chain, bring everything in the US, that somehow would have been beneficial. First of all, that would have tremendous economic costs, but that's a different conversation. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, this day and age, all it takes is a few infected individuals to take the plane, especially with COVID, which is something that can be transmitted, as we know by now, in an asymptomatic way, enter the country, and suddenly it's very easy to have a pandemic. So I don't think that this goes back to my point that no country is an island. I don't think that try to transform our countries into islands is the solution here. Pandemics are global, and despite our best efforts, they are going to reach our shores.
Okay, one final question, Ted. Do you see a role for international transfers to fund these preventive measures, and how would that work via multilateral or unilateral transfers?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. Who pays, right? I mentioned some mitigation measures that are supposed to, and we're confident that will reduce the probability. This involves costs, and the question is who pays. I think, as I said before, this is a global problem, and it requires a global solution. Many of these countries where the diseases emerge, and I already mentioned Ebola incidents in Africa, are not countries that have the resources to pay the full bill on this. So it has to be a combination, and developed nations, especially since we are paying some of the costs once this pandemic reaches, it makes sense for us to contribute our share.
Okay, thank you very much, Ted. That's just fascinating work.
Thank you, George. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Let's turn to our next speaker, who is Malesh Pai. Malesh is an associate professor in our department and a fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. And this is his 5th year at Rice. His current research interests include mechanism design and auction theory, the economics of privacy, and the economics of machine learning. His talk today, some of which is based on an article that just won the American Economic Journal Microeconomics Best Paper of the Year Award, is entitled Efficiency versus Equality in Equilibrium. Malesh.
Hi. Let me just set up. Sorry. This will take a second. Hi, everyone. All right. I hope everyone can see me and can see my slides. I heard we had some trouble getting started in the last one. The topic of my talk is efficiency, inequality, and equilibrium. And in particular, what we're trying to do here is shoot for some alliteration to get a nice title. Now, as you can, I'm an economic theorist. And what that means is, A, I have the privilege of sitting and thinking for a living, but additionally, not only do I have the privilege of sitting and thinking for a living, I also have the privilege of not needing to look at the data because I'm a theorist. My field of research is a field called mechanism design, and mechanism design has been in the news recently. It was the winners of this year's Nobel Prize in economics, Paul Milgram and Bob Wilson, are people who have contributed to this field, as also the winners of 2012, Al Roth and Lloyd Shapley, but also 2007, Roger Myerson, Eric Maskin, and Leo Horvich. I'm glad to follow in their tradition. So what is the field of mechanism design? Broadly, it's based on the following idea. Society often has to make choices. We need to decide who gets what. So we need to allocate scarce resources. For example, governments have to decide who get licenses, or governments have to decide which company they procure goods and services from. Alternately, bodies around us have to classify people. So lenders have to decide who is creditworthy for a loan, or employers have to decide who gets called back for an interview. And conversely, judges, for instance, need to decide whether somebody gets bail or gets thrown in jail. All of these choices have different institutional features, but a high-level common feature is that the information we need to make these choices is dispersed among society. In particular, some of the information we need to make these decisions is held privately by the very people who are either helped or hurt by the choices that we make. So the question we want to ask and answer is, can we design institutions, mechanisms, to achieve good outcomes? In particular, can we design an institution that achieves a good outcome even when we take into account that the agents are strategic and they'll game the system, taking into account the rules of the game? Okay, so that's the high-level question. And there's one sort of loaded word I've left here, and that word is good. What is a good outcome? So here's a caricature of a good outcome. It's if you think of the social sciences, there are two words in there, social and science. And a caricature is that the science half of social is focused on things like efficiency and accuracy. And the social part of the social sciences are people like ethicists, humanist philosophers that are concerned about things like equality or fairness. Does your institution treat different demographics or treat different groups the same way? Different genders, different races, things like that. It's not the case that there is a constant fight just between people who want to be as efficient as possible versus people who want to be as fair as possible. A lot of people like me, but broadly also within the larger community of economists, want to think about trade-offs between what you can achieve efficiently versus what are the underlying costs or benefits versus equality. And in practice, what that means often comes down to is that what you try and do is you try and design the most efficient policy you can, while taking care of your fairness concerns, either by enforcing a procedural rule. So for instance, you might say, do the best you can, but when you do this, you have to be race blind or gender blind in deciding who gets what. Sometimes designing or enforcing a rule is too hard. So instead of enforcing a rule on the procedure, you say, society tells the people making choices, go ahead and make choices any which way you want. Instead, we'll turn back around and audit the outcomes. So instead of judging you based on the procedure you claim to use, you do what you want. We'll turn back around and after you're done and check how you have performed in terms of disparate impact on different groups. What I want to talk about today is a little bit about new trade-offs and new issues, both in terms of what it means to enforce a procedural rule versus what it means to audit an outcome. All right. So here's sort of, so let's start with procedural rules. So procedural rules often boil down to something of the form that if you can guarantee that it's being done in a blind way, you achieve fairness. And this sounds plausible at the surface, but we've known for at least 100 years that there are issues with enforcing procedural rules. So the oldest issues of how to think about, my green screen is failing, I apologize. There we go, that's much better. So we've known for at least 100 years that just because you design a rule that is ostensibly neutral does not mean that its outcomes are neutral. So this is a picture, you can actually download a high-res version from the Rice Library. This is a picture of the city of Houston from the 1930s. Down here is Rice Institute, by the way. You know this picture is old because it's called Rice Institute on the map. And this is an infamous redlining map of Houston. So what that meant is if you went and tried to get a mortgage, the mortgage officer could not legally look at your race, but nevertheless, the mortgage officer could look at where you were applying for a loan. And if it was in the green area, that was good. If it was in the blue area, that was pretty good. But if you were in a red area or a yellow area, that wasn't that good. And they would probably deny you a loan. And one of the things, if you know anything about the geography of Houston, especially if you know anything about the geography of Houston and what it was historically, you know that the racial composition of people living in red areas was very different than the racial composition of people living in green areas. So even though the rule is ostensibly neutral, it has very disparate impacts by race. Now, let's add one more layer onto this story by telling you a different part of Texas history. So here's a part of Texas history that's slightly more modern. It's a rule that has achieved some notoriety. It's called the Texas Top 10. So here's the story. In 1996, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in Hopwood v. Texas outlawed using race as a factor in college admissions. So essentially, in Hopwood v. Texas, the Fifth Circuit said, if you are a public university, you cannot use, my understanding is, it said, you cannot use race to determine whether someone, you cannot use an applicant's race to determine whether or not they get into college. It just can't be a factor legally. Now, this concerned universities in Texas because they were worried about their ability to both attract a diverse pool of students and also about their ability to do affirmative action. You can't affirmatively act in favor of a race if you don't even know what race the candidate is. So in 1998, again, the Texas House stepped in and it instituted a top 10% rule. If you were a student who graduated from the top 10% of your high school class, you were guaranteed admission to a state-funded university. I should point out both the case law has changed. So the Supreme Court overruled parts of Hopwood v. Texas, and the top 10% rule has changed. Let's just, I don't want to get into the specifics of affirmative action policy. Just want to talk about this policy as a theoretical construct. Let's look at this policy. It just says, if you're in the top 10% of your high school class, you are guaranteed admission to any state-funded university of your choice. And in theory, this is a perfectly allowable rule under the case law of Hopwood v. Texas. It doesn't ask for or look at your race. But in practice, again, we know that this will impact different people differently. It uses the high school attended as a proxy. And we know that because where people live is highly correlated with their race, the high school that people go to is highly correlated with race. So in practice, this case law, law is using high school attended as a practice, as a proxy for diversity goals. Now the final part of the puzzle. So let me point out that the high school attended, unlike your race, is not immutable. So in particular, people looked back at this data a decade later. So they looked back at who was going to high school where, and they found that it wasn't just that this was the Texas 10% law was doing something. It was additionally that people were strategically choosing what high school they went to in response to taking into account their probability of getting into a public college in Texas. So if you were going into high school and you were thinking to yourself, I'm 11% in my high school, I'm at the 89th percentile, you could be strategic and you could move to potentially a lower performing high school. Indeed, we found, not me, but economists found evidence that at least 5% of marginal high school students were strategically enrolling in a different high school to take into account their probability of being in the top 10. So where do I come into this? Well, my interest, like I said, is mechanism design, and in particular, a big sub-area of mechanism design is auctions. A lot of things, a lot of the choices that especially governments make are run by auctions. And governments like auctions, partly because they're efficient, but partly because regulators, oversight bodies, things like that, who want to ensure that government bodies are doing things in a clean and above board fashion and not just handing out contracts to a preferred supplier, come in on top of an auction and put legal constraints on the kinds of things that a government can do. So both in the US and in the EU, and in Japan, there are various codified laws that say things like, if you are going to contract a certain thing, or you're going to run you're going to try and sell licenses, you have to run an auction that requires a certain kind of anonymity. What is this anonymity? It basically is that competitors are submitting bids. The best bid wins. And from the perspective of the government, they don't see who the bidders are. They only have to see the bids and choose based on the bids that are being selected. They choose who is winning and who is paying how much based on what bid is, what the bids are. So the question you might have then is, this sounds like it's airtight. So we're not using something like which high school somebody went to or where they're living. You don't have additional data like this. All you see is bids. It's purely anonymous. The question we asked in this paper, the one that George was kind enough to mention won an award recently, was, can the auctioneer still squeeze in some favoritism by carefully designing the auction rules? Now, of course, if they just were to ignore the law, they could do a lot of stuff, but while still staying compliant of this law. And what we showed was that surprisingly, in theory, the auctioneer has almost total flexibility. So even though they have to run a symmetric anonymous auction, that is, they have to treat all the bidders the same, nevertheless, they can design an auction in which in equilibrium, they prefer the bidder that they want to prefer. So let me tell you sort of at a high level what's going on here. When you put a procedural constraint on, let's say, a government auctioning body, you're only saying that the rules have to be the same for all the bidders who are participating in the auction. Let's just think that the government is trying to auction a license, and there are two people bidding for this license. There's a weak bidder, a bidder who isn't that competitive, but is the bidder that is the government's favorite. On the other hand, there is a strong bidder, a large multinational corporation or something like that, who this government official does not want to favor. Now, even though the government has to run an auction in which the rules are the same, the rules in which these two participate, note that from the perspective of these two bidders, they're facing asymmetric situations. So even though they're facing the same rules in the auction, the strong bidder knows that they are facing a weak bidder, and the weak bidder knows that they're facing a strong bidder. When you choose to bid, you take into account your strategic situation. So you're going to bid as a weak bidder, taking into account that you're facing the strong bidder. When you're the strong bidder, you bid taking into account that you're facing a weak bidder. So their bids will reflect this asymmetry in roles, even though they face symmetric rules. The main insight of our paper is that a well-designed auction can exploit this asymmetry in roles. That is, even with symmetric rules, strategizing by bidders, the fact that they're strategizing asymmetrically will mean that the two bids that the buyers, that the auctioneer are seeing is asymmetric. They are statistically different. And the strategizing by bidders can undo behind the veil of ignorance protections, even when the auctioneer doesn't see additional information like high school or any other identifying information like we saw in those previous examples. And therefore, stronger protections may be needed. Now, you might ask, what about in practice? Do we see any evidence that anything like this happens in practice? And this is when any theorist gets a smile on their face. I haven't seen any evidence that what we are suggesting can happen has happened in practice. But we have seen evidence that rules that are put in by the government or by an auctioning body ostensibly for one purpose are nevertheless rules that would also make sense for a completely different, almost opposite purpose. So here's a quick sort of detour into that idea. So again, imagine that there's a weak bidder and a strong bidder in an auction. Imagine sort of a local small business and up against AT&T bidding for a license for Spectrum. Now, auctions work because the different bidders or auctions give high revenues to a seller because the different buyers put competitive pressure on each other. But if one bidder is weak and one bidder is strong, then the weak bidder can't put that much competitive pressure on the strong bidder. And so you'd expect lower auction revenue on average. Theory suggests that if you want to turn around and get more revenue out of the auction, what you should do is privilege the weak bidder. So for instance, state that you will give the good to the weak bidder whenever their bid is within 15% of the strong bidder's bid. If you do this, you basically pressure the strong bidder to bid even more aggressively and hopefully make more money for yourself on average by doing that. Now, this lovely paper by Ayres and Crampton showed that the FCC has rules, and governments often, even more broadly, governments have rules, for instance, favoring small businesses. The FCC in license auctions has rules that favor minority and women-owned businesses, small businesses in license auctions. You could justify this from a diversity perspective, But you could also justify this, if you looked at auction theory, from just a cold cash neutral. You want to make, as the FCC, as much cash in as possible in auctioning licenses. So you have, the point I'm trying to make here is that there isn't all, when you take into account the equilibrium effects of a particular policy or policy constraint, there's not always a linear connection from what policy you're putting in place to its effects. All right. So we've known for a long time that requiring fairness of procedure might be too hard. People can circumvent these constraints in ways that we've described in the past few slides. And so the question then is, instead of constraining procedure, what about if we audit outcomes? These ideas go all the way back to at least Gary Becker. That's Gary Becker on my slide over there, winning the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He also won the Nobel Prize way back. I'm going to tell this story in the context of machine learning algorithms. And machine learning algorithms are increasingly important these days. Anytime you apply for a loan, anytime you apply for an entry-level job, it's more likely than not that your data is going to be processed by an algorithm that then tries to judge how creditworthy you are or how employable you are. These algorithms are also used these algorithms have also been put into play in taking the criminal history or the broader history of a defendant to judge whether they are at high risk to recommit a crime. These risk scores are given to judges to then inform them on whether to bail the defendant or to keep them in jail. And a ProPublica article in 2016 sort of greatly stirred the public sphere when it basically looked at the data on these machine scores and said that it's biased against blacks. Here was their data. They said if you were among 31% of black defendants who did not reoffend, 31% of them were deemed high risk, whereas 15% of white defendants who did not reoffend were deemed high risk. So you were much more likely to not reoffend if you were deemed high risk of committing a violent crime if you were black than if you were white. And this was a smoking gun of racial bias in this algorithm. But Compass, the provider who writes this algorithm, came back to responded that no, our algorithm is not biased. What our algorithm does is it assigns any given defendant a risk score. So pick your favorite risk score, for example, 6. The chance of recidivism, what this chart shows is that the chance of recidivism of a person who gets, let's say, a score of 6 is roughly the same, whether you're black or white. So your race does not matter in terms of your risk score. Now, this might seem confusing. Maybe one of these people lied, but actually, no. Both of these things can happen simultaneously. So you could both have what are called calibrated risk scores, but nevertheless have very different type 1 or type 2 errors. And to make matters worse, you can't have it all. So both of these sound like very plausible and logical requirements to ask of your machine learning algorithm, but you can't have both. And indeed, an additional complication that you might have as society is that you worry about Goodhart's law. So if you change the algorithm that you're using to classify people, people adjust their behavior. Very good. So what do we do? In a recent paper, what we show or what we study is a setting in which the classification rule affects the incentives to engage in the very activity that we're trying to predict. And indeed, we show that by equating type 1 error, that is by equating the prediction error across the two populations, you actually equate incentives and you can both get a notion of fairness, but additionally also get prediction efficiency. I know I'm going a bit fast here, but well, this was just to give you guys a high level taste of the things I'm thinking about. So in conclusion, there are tons of interesting questions trying to understand the trade-offs or lack thereof between efficiency type objectives and fairness type objectives. It's made even more nuanced and interesting by the fact that different kinds of fairness are incompatible. And you want to think carefully about what kind of fairness you want. You also want to think carefully about the incentives or the strategic response of people taking into account the rules that you write down. And I think these kinds of questions will become more and more important, understanding disparate impact as machines and machine learning algorithms increasingly determine who gets what and why. So we're going to have to try and stay on top and stay ahead of the arms race to track these things. I'm going to stop here. These were my slides, and I've gone 2 minutes over time, so hopefully George will forgive me.
Okay, I definitely forgive you. So great talk, great talk. Got a time for a couple of questions. One of our listeners is struggling a little with the intuition behind the result and asking if you could provide a little more intuition on the result that a symmetric auction can be designed to discriminate among bidders, perhaps in the context of oil and gas lease auctions.
Sorry, could you repeat that? I missed it.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so can you provide some additional intuition on your result that a symmetric auction can be designed to discriminate among bidders, perhaps in the context of oil and gas lease auctions?
Okay, so oil and gas auctions are complicated. Oil and gas lease auctions are slightly more complicated, and in particular, oil and gas lease auctions are what we call interdependent value auctions. So the idea being that at the end of the day, oil and gas auctions have, a particular oil and gas, a particular tract has a certain amount of oil in it. So if I see you bid a lot for it, I have to take that into account. Our model doesn't speak to that. Our model speaks to what are called private value auctions. Private value auctions means that my value for the good is my value for the good. If I see you bid a lot or a little for the good, that changes my likelihood of winning or losing, but it doesn't change how much I value the auction object. Let me try and give you a little bit of intuition. The construction is, of course, purely theoretical, but here's the idea. Suppose you had two bidders, right? So you had two bidders. One bidder has a value that is somewhere between 0 and 10. Let's say uniformly random variable between 0 and 10. The other bidder is a weaker bidder. And to capture the fact that it's a weaker bidder, suppose it's a uniform random variable between 0 and 5. Okay, so their value is less, and it's a random number, so there's still some randomness, but it's likely to be a lower value. Even though the rules of the auction are symmetric, a priori, the government and the bidders, the bidders understand that they're facing asymmetric situations. So the bidder who has a value between 0 and 5 understands that the other bidder over there has a value somewhere between 0 and 10. The bidder who is 0 and 10 understands that he's facing a bidder who is 0 and 5, and the government understands that statistically, the bids that these two people are likely to put in are different. So because statistically, the bids that these two people are likely to be different, it can load payments or rebates based on bids that are statistically more likely to be made or not made by one bidder versus the other. Okay, that's sort of the high-level idea that even though the rule is symmetric, the fact that one of you is more likely to do certain things than the other type means that I can load up payments on those rules. I without pen and paper or without a chalkboard, I'd struggle to get more detail than that, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks very much. We've got time for one more. So the question is it in practice much more likely that proposals are structured to explicitly favor a bidder that is preferred to win? And what does your analysis say about ways that that process can be restricted?
Good. So it is indeed true that a lot of the favoritism in auctions, a lot of the favoritism in auctions is precisely done at the pre-phase. So exactly as this questioner suggests, you're sort of, it's not at the auction phase that the government is doing something weird. It's just the day before that, they try to write the rules of they try to write the very thing that they're calling for bids for in a way that favors the bidder that they want to win. And that's not something that we have a ton to say about. It's something that does come in a lot. And indeed, it's just more evidence, I think, that the way I want you to think about this is, as a society, we have two choices, or we have at least two choices, but we often have to choose between coming in from the outside and setting restrictions on the procedures that can be used. And the other thing is coming in from the outside and looking after the procedure has been run and sort of judging the outcome. And I think all these things point to constraining procedures is very hard, because you have to write down very specific rules that, for instance, in the auction design setting, the proposal design setting, you'd have to very specifically define what it means for a proposal to favor or not favor proposed bidders. Maybe you could do that if you were a county executive, but it'd be very hard for a Supreme Court to sit on top and write down a rule that everyone could follow. So that's why constraining procedures is hard, and indeed we need to think about evaluating outcomes instead.
All right, excellent. I'd like to thank you, Malesh, and Ted as well, for two extremely interesting and provocative talks. And thanks to all of you for attending. We hope to see you at our next RISE event. We'll have another Nobel laureate lecture series coming up, not this November, but next November. And we hope that you enjoy many of the upcoming events during the OWL Together celebration. Thanks very much.